Okay, so first I'd like to talk about the Speechly programming model. And in particular, I want to compare this with a high-level model of how graphical user interfaces are usually implemented in general. And there's two reasons why I want to talk about this. The first is to highlight that developing with Speechly differs only little from basic user interface programming that some of you might be familiar with. And the second reason is that if you already have a fully functional user interface, then adding voice to this is extremely simple with Speechly. And since we're today mostly interested in deploying Speechly on the web, let's think of a website with some dynamic UI components. This could be, for example, the electronics store demo we just saw a while ago. So let's move on and see the demo again. Okay, and now if you let the video play, as you can see, actually, it's possible to interact with this user interface just by using these drop-downs to select different filters. And notice how the UI is updated whenever any of the filters is changed. So in fact, this special voice user interface is under the hood also something that you might actually call just a normal user interface. So let's keep that in mind as we now move on to the next slide. And let's think a bit about how to program such a dynamic website. So on the page, there are some UI components that the user can interact with. And in this example, there are drop-down menus, as you saw. But they could just as well be buttons or text fields, or maybe some special components that are activated by a swipe gesture, for example. So let's think of the following model. When a user interacts with a component, as is shown here, an event is triggered by the UI framework. In response to this event, a piece of code runs somewhere. And finally, the appearance of the web page is updated to reflect changes in the state of the application. In our demo, the search results that you see are updated. So importantly, what it says here now is that an event occurs. So while the low-level technical details of this event triggering are not exactly rocket science, it's still something pretty tedious. So in practice, it might involve somehow tracking the screen coordinates of all components of the application and detecting the screen position where the mouse pointer was when the user clicked and so on. But no web developer has ever had to think about any of that complexity, right? So that's because the browser and underlying UI framework take care of it. So all the developer has to do is define what happens when a UI event occurs. And this piece of code that's mentioned in this third step shown here, this defines the functionality of the UI component. So if the user interacts with a dropdown, this code defines what happens in the program when the menu value is changed. And now the reason I spent so much time talking about this seemingly trivial thing is because developing with Speechly happens in the same way. So let's look at the next slide and see the same demo. So now there's no voice, but this is basically how the demo works when you speak to it, as we saw earlier. So note that in addition to the search results, what happened was that also the drop-down menus changed. So under the hood, the UI somehow reacts to some kind of voice events by manipulating these drop-downs according to what the user said. And everything else in the UI remains exactly the same as before. So let's continue to the next slide. And here we now see the same four-step process that I showed earlier. So where do Speechly and voice now somehow enter the picture here? Well, in a Speechly voice UI, the events are triggered when a user says something. So for example, the user might be saying, show me t-shirts. But again, you don't have to worry about the low-level specifics of triggering the event. All you must do as a developer is write a piece of code that reacts to the event. And this is now the analogy. So just like the browser figures out if and on what component the user clicked, Speechly takes care of all the technical details that convert voice to events. And if we move on to the next slide, then we could think about what's the take-home message of all of this. So first of all, if you have a working website or mobile application, with Speechly, you can add voice functionalities to it. And this means actually that voice does not have to be confined to some isolated ecosystem, but with our technology, you can really bring voice to some kind of a center stage, say at the front page of an existing high traffic website. And the second point here is that this does not require a lot of specialized expertise. Our tools provide front-end developers an experience that is nearly identical to working on a dynamic website, like in general.